A peaceful night was disrupted by a pack of wolves digging frantically. When they unearthed the newly buried coffin, no one was ready for what they would find inside. What they uncovered shocked everyone. In the shadow of the majestic Rocky Mountains, the small town of Whitefish, Montana, held secrets that would forever change the lives of those who dared to venture deep into its ancient forests. Ethan Matthews had always felt an inexplicable pull toward nature, a connection that ran deeper than mere appreciation for its beauty. His daily walks through the less traveled paths of the forest had become a ritual, a way to commune with the wilderness that seemed to speak to his very soul. On this particular autumn morning, the crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine needles and early frost, as Ethan ventured further into the woods than usual. The sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, creating a dancing pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. Something felt different today, a charge in the air, an anticipation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. That's when he saw them. 3 wolves, their lean frames suggesting they hadn't eaten in days. They stood at the edge of a small clearing, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that should have sparked fear. But fear wasn't what Ethan felt. Instead, a wave of compassion washed over him as he observed their dignified bearing despite their obvious hunger. Without hesitation, Ethan slowly reached for his backpack. The wolves watched his every movement, but their posture remained curious rather than aggressive. He pulled out a piece of dried meat he'd packed for his lunch, and maintaining eye contact with what appeared to be the leader of the small pack, gently placed it on the ground before taking several steps backward. The wolves' response defied everything Ethan had learned about wild animals. Rather than wait for him to leave, they approached the offering while he was still present, maintaining a respectful distance but showing no signs of fear or aggression. As they shared the meat among themselves, Ethan felt as though he was witnessing something extraordinary, a bridge being built between 2 worlds. That evening, when Ethan returned home to his wife Clare, his eyes sparkled with excitement as he recounted his encounter. Clare's initial reaction was one of concern, her protective instincts kicking in as she imagined her husband face to face with wild predators. But there was something in the way Ethan described the experience that gave her pause, a sense of wonder and connection that she had never heard in his voice before. "You should have seen them, Clare," Ethan said, pacing their cozy living room with animated gestures. "They weren't just hungry animals. There was intelligence in their eyes, a kind of awareness that I can't explain." Clare watched her husband closely, noting how this encounter had awakened something in him. Despite her reservations, she found herself drawn into his enthusiasm. "Do you think they'll be there again?" she asked, surprising herself with her curiosity. "I don't know," Ethan replied, looking out their window toward the forest that bordered their property. "But I'm going back tomorrow. I can't explain it, but I feel like this wasn't just a chance meeting." Over the next few days, Ethan returned to the clearing, each time bringing food for the wolves. To his amazement, they were always there, waiting. With each visit, the distance between them grew smaller, the trust stronger. The wolves began to display behavior that seemed almost domestic, sitting calmly in his presence, occasionally wagging their tails, even appearing to recognize his footsteps as he approached. Clare noticed the change in her husband. He seemed more alive, more connected to something greater than himself. Her curiosity finally got the better of her fear, and one day she made a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. "Take me with you," she said one morning as Ethan prepared for his daily visit to the clearing. "I want to understand what you've been experiencing." Ethan's face lit up with joy, but concern flickered in his eyes. "Are you sure? They're still wild animals, Clare. I can't guarantee how they'll react to someone new." Clare stood firm in her resolve. "I trust you, and if what you've been telling me is true, I think I can trust them too. Something tells me this is important, not just for you, but for both of us." As they prepared for their joint venture into the forest, neither Clare nor Ethan could have imagined how this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the natural world, about themselves, and about the thin line between reality and the inexplicable. The morning Clare first accompanied Ethan to meet the wolves dawned with an unusual stillness. Mist clung to the ground as they made their way through the forest, their footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles. Claire's heart raced with each step, but Ethan's steady presence beside her kept her fears at bay. As they approached the clearing, Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "They're already here," he whispered, nodding toward 3 shadowy figures at the edge of the trees. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she saw them, magnificent creatures, their silver-grey fur catching the early morning light. They were nothing like the vicious beasts she had imagined. "Stay behind me," Ethan murmured, slowly moving forward with the familiar packet of dried meat. To Claire's amazement, the wolves' eyes followed them with what could only be described as recognition. The largest of the 3, whom Ethan had started calling Shadow, took a tentative step forward. What happened next defied explanation. Instead of showing aggression or fear toward the newcomer, Shadow sat down, tilted his head, and fixed his gaze directly on Clare. There was something in those amber eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom, of secrets held in the depths of these forests for generations. "It's okay," Ethan encouraged, noticing Clare's trembling hands. "They sense your energy. Just breathe." Following her husband's advice, Clare took a deep breath and allowed herself to relax. As she did, the atmosphere in the clearing shifted. The other 2 wolves, smaller but equally magnificent, moved closer. Their movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if they were welcoming her into their sacred space. The visit lasted longer than either of them expected. Clare found herself sitting on a fallen log, watching in wonder as the wolves accepted food from Ethan's hands. Eventually, the smallest of the pack, a female with unusual white markings on her chest, approached Clare and lay down at her feet, a gesture of trust that brought tears to her eyes. "I've never seen them this comfortable with anyone else," Ethan said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's like they've been waiting for you, too." On their walk home, Clare's perspective had shifted completely. "I understand now," she said, linking her arm through Ethan's. "There's something special about them. Something almost supernatural." The weeks that followed established a new rhythm in their lives. Their visits to the clearing became a shared ritual, a time when the boundaries between human and wild seemed to blur. The wolves grew increasingly comfortable with their presence, displaying behaviors that sometimes seemed more like those of guardian spirits than wild animals. Then came the morning when Clare discovered she was pregnant. The news filled their home with joy, but it also brought new considerations. The forest visits became less frequent as Clare's pregnancy progressed, though her connection to the wolves seemed to grow stronger, even in their absence. She began having vivid dreams of running through the forest with them, dreams that felt more like memories than fantasy. Ethan noticed subtle changes in the wolves' behavior during his solo visits. They seemed more alert, more protective, often scanning the surroundings as if watching for unseen threats. Shadow, in particular, would sometimes lead Ethan along specific paths, as if trying to show him something important. One evening, as Clare sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, she felt a presence. Looking toward the tree line, she spotted Shadow standing at the forest's edge, his form barely visible in the growing darkness. Instead of fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of protection. "Ethan," she called softly, and her husband joined her on the porch. Together they watched as Shadow maintained his vigil until the last light faded from the sky. It was as if the wolf was establishing himself as a guardian, not just of the forest, but of their growing family. As Clare's pregnancy progressed, strange occurrences began to multiply. Objects would appear to move on their own in their home, especially items related to the baby. The wind chimes on their porch would ring on perfectly still days. And most peculiarly, Clare would sometimes wake up to find fresh wildflowers on their doorstep, despite the fact that their property was fenced and gated. But it wasn't until Clare reached her 3rd trimester that the true extent of their unusual connection with the wolves began to reveal itself. During a particularly strong thunderstorm, when the power had gone out across Whitefish, all 3 wolves appeared at their doorstep, their behavior urgent and agitated. That same night, a massive old tree fell across the main road leading to the hospital, the very route they would have taken if Clare had gone into labor. The incident left both Ethan and Clare with an unshakable feeling that there was more to their wolf friends than met the eye. As they prepared for their baby's arrival, they couldn't help but wonder what other mysteries the forest held, and what role these extraordinary creatures would play in their child's life. The arrival of Lily Matthews into the world coincided with one of the most unusual phenomena Whitefish had ever witnessed. On the night Clare went into labor, an aurora borealis painted the Montana sky in sheets of ethereal green and purple, a sight rarely seen this far south. The hospital staff gathered at windows between their duties, marveling at the spectacle. But Ethan's attention was drawn to something else. 3 distinct shadows moving across the hospital grounds, keeping vigil. In the days following Lily's birth, the new parents noticed subtle signs that their daughter was extraordinary. Her eyes, a striking amber color reminiscent of their wolf friends, seemed to hold wisdom far beyond that of a newborn. She rarely cried, instead observing her surroundings with an intensity that both amazed and slightly unnerved visitors. "She has old eyes," Clare's mother had commented during her first visit, quickly crossing herself when Lily's gaze fell upon her. "Like she's been here before." The wolves' behavior changed dramatically during this period. Though Ethan's visits to the forest had become sporadic due to the demands of new parenthood, he occasionally caught glimpses of them patrolling the perimeter of their property. They maintained their distance but remained ever present, like silent guardians watching over the family. One particularly memorable incident occurred when Lily was 3 months old. During an unseasonably warm afternoon, Clare had taken the baby out to their back porch for some fresh air. As they sat in the old rocking chair, a strange stillness fell over the garden. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Looking up from her nursing baby, Clare found all 3 wolves standing at the edge of their yard, their posture formal, almost reverent. To Clare's astonishment, the wolves began to approach, moving with deliberate grace until they formed a semicircle around the rocking chair. Shadow, the largest, stepped forward and gently placed something at Clare's feet, a small, intricately carved wooden figurine of a wolf. The object looked ancient, its surface worn smooth by time, and Clare had no doubt it held significant meaning. When Ethan returned home that evening, he examined the figurine with growing excitement. "Look at these markings," he pointed out, showing Clare the strange symbols etched into the base. "They look similar to some Native American carvings I've seen in the local museum, but there's something different about them." As Lily grew from infant to toddler, her connection to the natural world became increasingly apparent. Plants seemed to flourish in her presence, and animals of all kinds were drawn to her. But it was her relationship with the wolves that truly defied explanation. During their carefully supervised visits to the clearing, Lily showed no fear whatsoever. She would toddle toward the massive creatures with complete confidence, and they would lower themselves to her level, displaying a gentleness that moved Clare to tears. Strange occurrences became more frequent as Lily approached her first birthday. Objects in her room would mysteriously rearrange themselves into geometric patterns while she slept. The mobile above her crib would spin on windless nights, casting shadows that seemed to tell ancient stories on the walls. And most remarkably, Lily began humming melodies that neither parent recognized, haunting tunes that seemed to echo from some distant past. One evening, as Clare was preparing dinner, she heard Lily giggling in the living room where she'd been playing under Ethan's supervision. When the laughter continued for several minutes, Clare went to investigate, only to find her daughter sitting alone, apparently having an animated conversation with thin air. "Where's Daddy?" Clare asked, trying to keep the alarm from her voice. "Outside," Lily replied, pointing to the window where Ethan could be seen checking the mail. "Shadow is telling me stories." Clare felt a chill run down her spine, for there was no wolf in the room, at least none that she could see. Yet Lily's attention remained fixed on a spot near the fireplace, her expression one of complete engagement. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Ethan and Clare sat in their kitchen, attempting to make sense of the day's events. The wooden figurine sat between them on the table, its mysterious symbols seeming to shift in the lamplight. "I think it's time we looked deeper into the history of this area," Ethan suggested, running his finger along the carved markings. "These wolves, these symbols, there's something here that goes beyond natural explanation." Before Clare could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, a long, melodious howl that seemed to carry words just beyond their understanding. As they rushed to the window, they saw all 3 wolves standing in their backyard, their heads raised to the moon. But what made their blood run cold was the sight of tiny footprints in the frost-covered grass, leading from their back door toward the forest. footprints that seemed to glow with a faint, bluish light. Racing through their moonlit backyard, Ethan and Clare followed the glowing footprints with hearts pounding in their chests. Relief flooded through them when they found Lily's bedroom window still securely locked, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her bed. But the luminescent tracks outside remained, raising questions that would haunt them through the night. The next morning, Ethan took the wooden figurine to the local museum, where he met with Dr. Sarah Henderson, an anthropologist specializing in Native American artifacts. As she examined the carving under a magnifying glass, her expression shifted from professional interest to barely concealed excitement. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, tracing the symbols with a gloved finger. "These markings, they're similar to those used by the Blackfeet tribe, but there are elements here I've never seen before. Where did you say you found this?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It was given to us by some unexpected friends." "Doctor." Henderson raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, she pulled out a large leather-bound book from her shelf. "There are stories," she began, flipping through yellowed pages, "passed down through generations about spirit guides taking the form of wolves. They were said to protect certain children, those born with what the Blackfeet called the Old Knowing. Meanwhile, at home, Clare was experiencing something unusual of her own. While organizing Lily's room, she found drawings scattered across the floor, artwork she hadn't seen before. The crude crayon sketches showed 3 wolves, but there was something else. Behind each wolf stood a shadowy human figure, barely visible but unmistakably present. When Lily woke from her nap, Clare gently asked about the drawings. The little girl's response sent chills down her spine. "That's who they were before," Lily said matter-of-factly, pointing to each wolf in turn. "They're still inside their mommy. They just wear different coats now." At the museum, Dr. Henderson was sharing more revelations with Ethan. According to these records, there was a small group of tribal protectors who lived in these mountains over a century ago. They were said to have the ability to commune with nature spirits and even take animal form when necessary. She paused, studying Ethan's face carefully before continuing. "The interesting thing is, they disappeared suddenly in the winter of 1892. The only clue was a prophecy left carved into a cave wall, speaking of their return when they were needed most, when a child with star eyes would be born." Ethan's mind raced to Lily's unusual amber eyes, often flecked with gold in certain light. Dr. Henderson wasn't finished. "The most fascinating part," she continued, "is that the prophecy mentioned 3 guardians who would appear first as wolves, drawn to protect the child who would bridge 2 worlds." That evening, as Ethan shared his discoveries with Clare, Lily played in the garden under their watchful eyes. The 3 wolves had appeared at the forest's edge, as they often did now, maintaining their protective vigil. But this time something was different. As the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, both parents gasped as they noticed something extraordinary. For just a moment, as the light hit the wolves at a particular angle, they could see what appeared to be human silhouettes overlapping with the wolves' forms, transparent, shimmering outlines that seemed to shift between human and animal. The vision lasted only seconds, but it was enough to confirm their growing suspicions. Their quiet observation was interrupted by Lily's delighted laughter. She had arranged her toys in a perfect circle on the grass, and in the center lay something that made Clare's hand fly to her mouth. Another wooden figurine, identical to the first, but weathered differently, as if it had been carved in a different time. Inside the house, unnoticed by the family in the garden, the original figurine had begun to emit a soft, pulsing light, its mysterious symbols gradually rearranging themselves into new patterns. On the kitchen wall, shadows danced of their own accord, forming images that, had anyone been there to witness them, told a story of ancient guardians, sacred duties, and a destiny that was just beginning to unfold. A gust of wind swept through the garden, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, an ancient earthy smell that seemed to whisper of secrets long buried in the mountain's heart. The wolves raised their heads in unison, their eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight in a way that made them appear to glow from within. Something was changing in Whitefish, Montana, and the Matthews family stood at the center of a mystery that had waited generations to be revealed. The days that followed brought changes that even Ethan and Clare couldn't have anticipated. Lily's connection to the natural world grew stronger with each passing day. Plants in their garden began blooming out of season, clustering around areas where she played. Animals of all kinds, from tiny songbirds to curious deer, would gather near their property, drawn by some invisible force that seemed to emanate from the little girl. One morning, while Clare was preparing breakfast, she heard Lily's voice drifting from the backyard. Looking through the kitchen window, she froze at the sight before her. Lily sat cross-legged in the dewy grass, surrounded by a perfect circle of wildflowers that hadn't been there the night before. More astonishing were the butterflies, dozens of them far too early in the season, dancing around her daughter in synchronized patterns. "Ethan," she called softly, not wanting to break the magical moment. Her husband appeared beside her, coffee cup still in hand, and together they watched as their daughter conducted this extraordinary natural symphony with small waves of her tiny hands. The wolves, ever present now, lay at the edge of the property, their watchful eyes trained on Lily. But today they seemed different. Their forms appeared to shimmer in the morning light, occasionally becoming translucent enough to reveal those mysterious human silhouettes within. Dr. Henderson had become a regular visitor to their home, bringing ancient texts and artifacts that might help explain what was happening. During one such visit, she spread out a collection of weathered photographs on their dining room table. "These were taken in the late 1800s, she explained, pointing to sepia-toned images of tribal elders. "Look at their eyes." In each photograph, the subject's eyes seemed to reflect light in an unusual way, creating the same golden glow they often saw in Lily's. But it was another photograph that caught Clare's attention, a group of 3 individuals standing before a cave entrance. Though the image was faded, there was something hauntingly familiar about their poses, their watchful stances. Behind them, barely visible on the cave wall, were symbols identical to those on the wooden figurines. "The cave still exists," Dr. Henderson revealed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's deep in the mountains, but the trail was lost decades ago. According to legend, it holds answers about the Guardians and their purpose." That night, Lily had one of her most vivid dreams yet. She described it over breakfast the next morning, her small face serious as she spoke of walking through a torch-lit cave with her wolf friends, seeing pictures on the walls that told stories about tomorrow. Ethan and Clare exchanged glances, knowing they could no longer ignore the signs. Their daughter wasn't just connected to these mysterious guardians. She was part of something much bigger, something that had been set in motion long before her birth. Later that day, while Lily napped, Clare found herself drawn to the wooden figurines. As she held them both in her hands, something extraordinary happened. The symbols began to glow with a soft blue light, and in her mind she saw flashes of images. A cave mouth crowned with ancient markings, a path through the forest that seemed to shift and change, and 3 figures standing in a clearing, their forms fluid between human and wolf. The vision was interrupted by a sound from Lily's room, a melody, haunting and beautiful, in a language Clare didn't recognize. Running upstairs, she found her daughter still asleep, but the air around her bed seemed to shimmer with tiny points of light, like earthbound stars. Outside, the wolves began to howl, their voices carrying a harmony that perfectly matched Lily's song. The sound resonated through the house, causing the wooden figurines to vibrate in Clare's hands. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, those shadows seemed to take on shapes of their own, dancing images that told stories of ancient pacts, sacred duties, and a time when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was much thinner. Dr. Henderson's words from earlier echoed in Clare's mind. The legends speak of a time when the veils between worlds would grow thin again, when a child would be born who could walk in both realms. The Guardians would return to protect this child, to guide her as she learned to bridge these worlds. Standing in her daughter's doorway, watching the mysterious lights dance around her sleeping child while the wolves' song echoed through the valley, Clare realized they were standing on the threshold of something monumental. The signs were becoming clearer, the pieces falling into place, but they were still missing crucial parts of this ancient puzzle. What none of them could have known was that forces beyond their understanding were already in motion, drawing them inexorably toward a revelation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about reality itself. Spring had given way to summer, and with the changing season came an escalation of unexplainable events around the Matthews household. The wooden figurines now regularly emitted a soft, pulsing light at sunset, and the strange symbols carved into their bases seemed to shift and change when no one was looking directly at them. Lily's abilities continued to develop in ways that both amazed and concerned her parents. One afternoon, while playing in her room, she created perfect replicas of the cave drawings from Dr. Henderson's photographs using her crayons, drawings she had never seen. When asked how she knew what to draw, she simply replied, "The wolves showed me in my dreams." It was during one of Dr. Henderson's visits that they experienced something unprecedented. The anthropologist had brought a newly discovered journal written by a settler in the late 1800s, which mentioned the 3 guardian spirits. As she read passages aloud, Lily, who had been coloring quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up, her eyes glowing with an intense amber light. "They're calling us," she announced, pointing toward the forest. "We need to follow them now." At that precise moment, all 3 wolves appeared at the edge of the property, their postures urgent and expectant. The wooden figurines began to vibrate and glow more intensely than ever before. Even Dr. Henderson, who had maintained scholarly skepticism despite everything she'd witnessed, couldn't deny the charge of energy that filled the air. "I think," she said slowly, "we're meant to go with them." After quick preparations, the small group followed the wolves into the forest. Ethan carried Lily on his shoulders, while Claire clutched both wooden figurines in her hands, noting how they seemed to grow warmer and pulse more strongly as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. Dr. Henderson followed with her journal and camera, documenting everything. The wolves led them along paths that seemed to appear and disappear, through groves of ancient trees that whispered in languages long forgotten. The air grew thick with an otherworldly mist that somehow only affected the adults. Lily appeared to see through it clearly, occasionally pointing out landmarks that the others could barely distinguish. "Look," she would say, "the special flowers are showing us the way." Though the adults saw nothing but mist and shadows, they noticed that whenever they followed Lily's directions, the figurines' glow would intensify, confirming they were on the right path. As they ventured further into the wilderness, the forest itself seemed to change. The trees grew older, their trunks twisted into shapes that looked almost like frozen dancers. Moss-covered stones appeared at regular intervals, each bearing symbols similar to those on the figurines. The air hummed with an energy that made their skin tingle. Then, as they entered a particularly dense section of forest, something extraordinary happened. The mist that had been swirling around them suddenly gathered and condensed, forming translucent shapes that moved with purpose. Through these shapes, they caught glimpses of what appeared to be memories, scenes from long ago playing out like ghostly projections among the trees. They saw indigenous people in traditional dress performing ceremonies, European settlers building the first structures in what would become Whitefish, and most significantly, 3 figures who moved fluidly between human and wolf form, watching over it all. These scenes shifted and changed like smoke in the wind, but the message was clear. They were being shown the history of this land and its guardians. Dr. Henderson frantically took notes and photos, though she wasn't certain her camera could capture these ethereal visions. "This is unprecedented," she whispered, her academic demeanor cracking with excitement. "We're witnessing something that bridges the gap between history and legend." The wolves, leading them deeper into this mysterious realm, began to change as well. Their forms became increasingly fluid, the human silhouettes within them more distinct. The boundary between what was real and what was spirit seemed to blur with each step they took. Lily, still perched on her father's shoulders, began humming that strange melodic tune they'd heard her sing in her sleep. The wolves joined in with their howls, creating a harmony that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The mist shapes around them responded to the sound, swirling and dancing in patterns that matched the symbols on the wooden figurines. As they crested a small rise, the group found themselves facing a sheer rock face covered in ancient markings. The wolves stopped, and for the first time since their journey began, turned to face them directly. In the fading daylight, their eyes glowed with the same amber intensity as Lily's, and the distinction between their wolf and human forms became even less clear. They stood at the threshold of something momentous, a gateway between the world they knew and one they had only glimpsed in dreams and legends. The wooden figurines in Clare's hands had grown almost too hot to hold, their symbols now moving and shifting like living things. Whatever answers they sought lay just ahead, but crossing this boundary would require a leap of faith that would forever change their understanding of reality. As they stood before the rock face, Lily stretched out her small hand from her perch on Ethan's shoulders. The moment her fingers touched the ancient markings, a soft rumbling vibrated through the stone. The symbols began to glow with the same ethereal blue light as the wooden figurines, creating patterns that shifted and flowed like liquid starlight. Clare gasped as a section of the rock face began to shimmer, becoming translucent as mist. Through this ethereal veil, they could make out the entrance to a cave that seemed to exist between reality and dreams. The three wolves stepped forward, their forms now clearly showing the human spirits within them, creating a bridge between the physical world and whatever lay beyond. "The doorway only opens for those who carry the old knowing," Lily announced in a voice that seemed older than her years. "That's what Shadow told me." Dr. Henderson fumbled with her camera, trying to document this incredible moment, but found that her equipment wouldn't function. "It's as if technology itself can't cross this threshold," she murmured, tucking the camera away and pulling out her journal instead. With the wolves leading the way, they stepped through the misty barrier. The air inside the cave was surprisingly warm and seemed to pulse with its own subtle heartbeat. The walls were covered in elaborate paintings that appeared to move in the corner of their eyes. Images of wolves, spirits, and human figures, all interconnected in an endless dance. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the paintings began to tell a story. Dr. Henderson translated the symbols as they walked, her voice filled with wonder. "This speaks of a time when the physical and spiritual worlds were one," she explained, "and of chosen guardians who could walk between them." The cave opened into a vast chamber where crystalline formations caught and reflected light in impossible ways, creating a natural cathedral. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface carved with symbols that matched those on the wooden figurines. As Clare approached with the figurines in hand, they began to pulse with an intense light that filled the chamber. The wolves took positions around the altar, and before the astonished eyes of the adults, their forms began to shift more deliberately. The misty human shapes within them became clearer, more substantial, until they stood as three distinct figures, two men and a woman, dressed in clothing that seemed to span centuries of Native American and European styles. "We have waited long for this moment," the tallest of the three spoke, his voice echoing with the timbre of Shadow's howl. The child was prophesied, the one who would help restore the balance between worlds. Lily showed no fear as she climbed down from her father's shoulders and walked toward the transformed guardians. The female guardian knelt before her, her form still shifting slightly between human and wolf. "You carry within you the power of both worlds, little one," she said softly. "Just as we do." The chamber's crystals began to respond to Lily's presence, their light dancing and swirling around her like gentle spirits. The paintings on the walls seemed to come alive, showing scenes from the past, present, and possible futures. Among them, they saw images of Lily growing older, her powers developing, and the three guardians standing watch over her journey. Dr. Henderson scribbled frantically in her journal, trying to capture every detail of this extraordinary revelation. "The legends spoke of this," she whispered. "A time when the guardians would return to teach a child who could help heal the growing rift between the natural and spiritual worlds." The third guardian, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "But there are those who would prevent this healing," he warned, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Forces that prefer the worlds remain separated, who fear the power of unity." As if in response to his words, a cold wind swept through the chamber, causing the crystal lights to flicker. The guardians tensed, their forms briefly shifting back toward their wolf aspects. Something was stirring in the world above, something that had noticed the gathering in this sacred space. Clare pulled Lily close as the wooden figurines in her hands grew cold. The markings on the altar began to pulse with a warning rhythm, and the cave paintings shifted to show darker scenes, shadows threatening the delicate balance they had just begun to understand. The guardians exchanged knowing looks before the tallest spoke again. "We must prepare her," he said urgently. "The time is shorter than we thought, and she must learn to use her gifts before they try to stop her." The chamber filled with swirling mists as the guardians began to shift back into their wolf forms. But now the Matthews family and Dr. Henderson could see their true nature, ancient spirits who had taken these forms to protect and guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. What had begun as a mystery was rapidly becoming a mission, one that would require all of them to embrace a reality far more complex and magical than they had ever imagined. As they stood in that sacred space, surrounded by living history and ancient magic, they realized that their journey was not ending here, but truly beginning. The return journey from the cave proved more challenging than their initial venture. The forest seemed different somehow, as if their experience in the sacred chamber had altered their perception of reality itself. The trees whispered with new voices, and shadows moved in ways that defied natural law. Dr. Henderson had filled nearly an entire journal with observations and sketches, though she noticed that some of her earlier notes had mysteriously transformed into ancient symbols she couldn't decipher. It's as if the knowledge itself is alive, she mused, watching the ink shift and change on the page, adapting and protecting itself. Back at home, the Matthews family found their ordinary life transformed by their newfound understanding. Lily's abilities grew stronger with each passing day. She could now communicate with plants and animals without speaking, and her presence caused curious phenomena throughout their house. Light bulbs would brighten or dim in response to her emotions, and on several occasions, they found her bedroom furniture rearranged in perfect geometric patterns while she slept. The guardians, still in their wolf forms, maintained their vigilant watch but now appeared more frequently near the house. They began teaching Lily in their own way, through dreams and subtle gestures that only she seemed to understand. Clare would often find her daughter sitting cross-legged in the garden, deep in silent conversation with them. One morning, while Lily practiced her newfound abilities under the watchful eyes of the wolves, Clare noticed something unusual in their flower bed. Sprouting among their regular blooms were plants she had never seen before, flowers with petals that seemed to glow from within and leaves that chimed softly in the breeze. "They're protection flowers," Lily explained matter-of-factly when Clare asked about them. "Shadow says they'll help us know when the others are coming." "What others, sweetie?" Clare asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the chill that ran down her spine. Before Lily could answer, the wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and cold. The protection flowers began to chime more urgently, their glow intensifying. The guardians immediately moved closer to Lily, their forms shifting slightly between wolf and human as they scanned the surroundings. Ethan, who had been reviewing Dr. Henderson's notes in his study, rushed outside. The wooden figurines had begun vibrating violently, their symbols rearranging themselves into what appeared to be warnings. Through the kitchen window, they could see the shadows in their house moving independently of any light source, gathering in corners like dark water. Dr. Henderson arrived shortly after, clutching a newly discovered text. "I've found references to what we might be facing," she said breathlessly. "The ancient records speak of others who possessed powers similar to the Guardians, but chose to use them for personal gain. They were said to have been banished to a space between worlds, but the prophecy warned they would try to return when they sensed the presence of someone like Lily." As if in response to her words, the temperature around them dropped dramatically. Frost began forming on the windows despite the summer heat, and the protection flowers began to sing a mournful warning tone. The Guardians moved into a protective formation around the family, their forms now rapidly shifting between wolf and human as they responded to the growing threat. Lily, however, remained remarkably calm. She walked to the center of the garden and raised her small hands. The protection flowers responded immediately, their glow intensifying until it formed a dome of light around the property. The shadows that had been gathering retreated, hissing like steam. "They can't come closer," Lily announced confidently. "The Guardians taught me how to make a safe space. But they're still out there watching and waiting." That evening, as they sat in their protected home, the family began to understand the true magnitude of their situation. They weren't just witnesses to an ancient mystery anymore. They had become part of a cosmic struggle between forces they were only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Henderson spread her research across their dining room table, pointing out patterns and connections they hadn't noticed before. "The prophecy isn't just about Lily bridging worlds," she explained. "It's about a coming conflict, a battle for the very nature of reality itself." Outside, the Guardians maintained their vigil as darkness fell. Their eyes glowed with an intense amber light, matching the subtle illumination that now seemed to emanate from Lily herself. The protection flowers continued their gentle chiming, a reminder that while they were safe for now, greater challenges lay ahead. The days that followed brought an increasing sense of urgency to the Matthews household. Dr. Henderson practically moved in, converting their guest room into a makeshift research center filled with ancient texts, maps, and artifacts. The walls were covered with photographs and drawings of cave symbols, connected by red strings in an attempt to decipher their full meaning. Lily's training with the Guardians intensified. Each morning they would guide her through exercises that seemed to strengthen her connection to both the natural and spiritual worlds. Under their tutelage, she learned to create protective barriers of light, communicate with plants and animals, and even manipulate the weather on a small scale. One particularly memorable morning, Clare watched in amazement as her daughter sat in the garden, surrounded by a swirling vortex of autumn leaves that danced to music only she could hear. The Guardians, still in their wolf forms but now clearly showing their spiritual nature, moved around her in perfect synchronization, their movements teaching her an ancient dance of power. "The balance must be maintained," Lily explained later, her voice carrying that otherworldly wisdom that still startled her parents. "That's what the Guardians keep teaching me. Everything is connected. The trees, the wind, the earth, the spirit world. If one part becomes too strong or too weak, everything suffers." Ethan had taken to documenting everything in a journal of his own, hoping to create a record that might help others understand what they were experiencing. But he noticed that whenever he tried to write about certain aspects of Lily's training or the Guardian's true nature, his pen would skip across the page, leaving only indecipherable symbols. "Some knowledge isn't meant to be written down," the female Guardian explained during one of the rare moments when they appeared in their human forms. "It must be experienced, felt, lived. That's why we've waited so long for someone like Lily, someone who can understand with their heart as well as their mind." The protective flowers that Lily had planted continued to spread throughout their property, their chiming becoming a constant reminder of the unseen forces at work around them. Dr. Henderson discovered that the flowers were mentioned in ancient texts as spirit bells, plants that existed simultaneously in both the physical and spiritual realms. But despite their preparations, signs of approaching danger continued to multiply. The shadows that gathered at the edges of their property grew darker and more persistent. Strange lights appeared in the forest at night, moving in patterns that seemed to mock the protective formations of the spirit bells. And most concerning of all, other children in town began reporting dreams of shadowy figures calling them into the woods. Clare found herself awakening in the middle of the night to find Lily standing at her window, engaged in silent communion with the Guardians. The little girl's amber eyes would glow in the darkness as she practiced strengthening the protective barriers around their home. During these moments, Clare could almost see the strands of energy that connected everything, glowing threads that linked the spirit bells, the Guardians, and her daughter in an intricate web of light. One evening, as storm clouds gathered ominously over Whitefish, Dr. Henderson made a breakthrough in her research. "The prophecy speaks of a convergence," she announced, spreading several ancient maps across the kitchen table. "A time when the barriers between worlds grow so thin that they might tear completely. The forces we're sensing, they're not just fighting against Lily's abilities. They're trying to prevent her from healing a rift that's been growing for centuries." The wooden figurines, which had become more active with each passing day, suddenly began to pulse with an intense light. Outside, the Guardians raised their heads in unison, their forms flickering rapidly between wolf and human as they sensed something approaching. Lily walked to the center of their living room, her small form radiating a gentle but powerful light. "They're getting closer," she said quietly. "The ones who want to keep the worlds apart, but they don't understand. Keeping things separated isn't the answer. The Guardians have shown me that everything needs to be in balance." As if in response to her words, the storm clouds above their house began to swirl in unnatural patterns. The spirit bells chimed more urgently, their protective glow intensifying. The Guardians moved closer to the house, their ancient power manifesting as visible auras of light around their forms. The Matthews family stood together at their window, watching as the ordinary world they had known began to transform before their eyes. They were standing on the edge of something momentous, a convergence of forces that had been building for generations. And at the center of it all was their daughter, a child who somehow held the key to restoring balance to both worlds. The morning brought an eerie stillness to Whitefish. The air felt thick with anticipation, and even the townspeople who knew nothing of Lily's true nature sensed that something extraordinary was building. Birds fell silent, pets became restless, and the very atmosphere seemed to pulse with an ancient energy awakening from centuries of slumber. Dr. Henderson arrived early, her arms full of newly discovered documents. Her usual academic composure had given way to barely contained excitement as she spread the papers across the kitchen table. "I've found something remarkable," she announced, pointing to a series of drawings that seemed to move slightly when viewed from different angles. "These aren't just historical records, they're instructions." The drawings depicted elaborate circular patterns, similar to the ones Lily had been creating unconsciously in her sleep. But these were far more complex, showing how multiple circles could be interconnected to create powerful protective boundaries. More importantly, they showed how these patterns could be used to heal the growing rift between worlds. "Look at this," Dr. Henderson continued, carefully unfolding a weathered map. "There are places around Whitefish where the boundary between worlds is naturally thinner. The cave we visited is one of them, but there are others. And according to these records, if we can establish the right connections between these points, we might be able to stabilize the balance before it's too late." Outside, the Guardians had taken up positions around the property, their forms shifting more frequently now between wolf and human as they maintained their vigilant watch. The spirit bells chimed continuously, their melody becoming more complex and urgent with each passing hour. Lily sat in the garden, her small hands moving through the air as she practiced weaving light into protective patterns. Under the Guardian's guidance, she had learned to see the invisible threads that connected all living things. Now she worked to strengthen these connections, preparing for what they all sensed was coming. "The shadows are getting stronger," she said quietly, her amber eyes reflecting the afternoon sun. "They're trying to find ways through the spaces between things. But the Guardians say we can use that against them, use their own power to help heal the rift instead of making it bigger." Clare and Ethan watched their daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. The wooden figurines they kept nearby had begun to change, their carved symbols slowly aligning themselves with the patterns Lily was creating in the air. Even Dr. Henderson's scientific skepticism had given way to wonder as she documented these transformations. As evening approached, the unusual atmospheric conditions intensified. Clouds formed perfect circular patterns above their house, and the air began to shimmer with barely visible threads of light. The Guardians grew increasingly alert, their ancient power manifesting as visible auras that rippled through the air around them. Inside the house, the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, moving in ways that defied natural law. But now, instead of retreating from these dark spaces, Lily approached them with confidence. "They're just lost," she explained to her worried parents. "They've forgotten that darkness and light need each other. The Guardians have been teaching me how to remind them." Dr. Henderson had set up monitoring equipment around the property, though most of it functioned erratically in the charged atmosphere. "The convergence is accelerating," she reported, checking her instruments. "The barrier between worlds is becoming more permeable with each passing hour." As night fell, the family gathered in their living room, surrounded by the protective glow of the spirit bells. The wooden figurines pulsed with increasing intensity, their symbols now moving continuously, in patterns that matched the swirling clouds above. The Guardians had moved closer to the house, their forms now seeming to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Through the windows they could see other lights appearing in the forest, ancient powers awakening, as the boundaries between worlds grew thinner. But these lights were different from the threatening shadows they'd seen before. These seemed to respond to Lily's presence, aligning themselves with the protective patterns she had created. "It's starting," Lily announced calmly, standing in the center of the room as streams of light began to flow through the air around her. "But we don't need to be afraid. The Guardians have shown me what to do. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken thing is to let it come apart completely first, so you can put it back together the right way." The air in the room grew thick with potential as ancient powers converged around their small family. They stood on the precipice of a transformation that would affect not just their lives, but the very fabric of reality itself. And at the heart of it all was a little girl who understood what even the oldest beings had forgotten, that true balance comes not from separation, but from the harmony of all things. The transformation began as a subtle vibration in the air, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the earth. Inside the Matthews home, the wooden figurines started to levitate, spinning slowly as they emitted pulses of blue-white light that matched the rhythm of Lily's breathing. Doctor. Henderson's equipment sparked and shut down completely as the energy in the room intensified. The walls themselves appeared to become translucent at times, revealing glimpses of another world layered over their own, a realm of pure energy and ancient wisdom that had always existed alongside them, hidden from ordinary sight. "The veils are thinning," the tallest guardian announced, materializing in his human form beside Lily. The other two guardians followed, their transformations flowing like water as they took positions around the child. But we must be careful. The moment of greatest potential is also the moment of greatest vulnerability. Outside, the storm clouds had formed a perfect spiral above their house, creating a vortex that seemed to pierce through multiple layers of reality. The spirit bells rang out in complex harmonies, their chimes weaving together with the ethereal music that now filled the air, a symphony of natural and supernatural forces converging. Lily stood calmly in the center of it all, her amber eyes glowing with inner light as she began to move her hands in patterns that matched the swirling energies around them. Under her direction, the streams of light began to coalesce into more organized forms, creating a complex geometric network that spread throughout the house and beyond. "Look," Claire gasped, pointing toward the forest. Through the windows they could see similar patterns of light emerging from the trees, rising from the earth itself. The ancient powers of the land were awakening, responding to Lily's call. "It's incredible, Doctor," Henderson whispered, frantically sketching in her journal even as the pencil marks seemed to take on a life of their own. "She's not just connecting with these forces, she's helping them remember how to work together." The Guardians moved in perfect synchronization with Lily, their ancient knowledge flowing through her as she worked to strengthen the bonds between worlds. But as the convergence intensified, other forces began to stir. The shadows at the edges of their protective barrier grew darker, more substantial, taking on forms that seemed to writhe with desperate hunger. "They're afraid," Lily explained, her voice carrying echoes of ancient wisdom. "They've been alone in the dark for so long they've forgotten that they were once part of the light too. We need to help them remember." To everyone's amazement, Lily began to extend tendrils of light toward the shadows, not to banish them, but to offer connection. The Guardians tensed but did not interfere, recognizing that this child understood something that had eluded even them, that true healing could only come through integration, not opposition. Some of the shadows recoiled from the light, but others responded to Lily's gentle invitation. As they touched the luminous strands, they began to transform, their darkness softening into deeper shades of purple and blue that harmonized with the golden light around them. "The balance is shifting," the female guardian observed, her form flickering between human and wolf as the energies swirled around them. "But there are still those who resist, who cling to the old separations. They will try to disrupt what we're building here." As if in response to her words, a powerful tremor shook the house. The protective patterns of light wavered as something massive pressed against them from the outside, a force that had grown strong during the long centuries of division, feeding on fear and isolation. Ethan and Claire moved instinctively to shield their daughter, but Lily remained serene. "It's okay," she assured them, even as the pressure intensified. "This is part of the healing too. Sometimes the hardest things to fix are the ones that don't know they're broken." The wooden figurines spun faster, their symbols now burning so brightly they were difficult to look at directly. The spirit bells rang out in a crescendo of sound that seemed to pierce through multiple dimensions at once. And through it all, Lily continued her intricate dance of light and shadow, working to restore a balance that had been lost for generations. They stood together in that extraordinary moment, watching as their ordinary world transformed around them, knowing that whatever came next would require all of their courage, trust, and love to face. The convergence had begun, and with it the real test of everything they had learned was about to unfold. The pressure against Lily's protective barriers continued to build, manifesting as waves of dark energy that rippled through the air like northern lights in reverse. But instead of fear, the little girl's face showed only determination and compassion as she worked to maintain the delicate balance she had created. "They're getting closer now," she announced, her voice carrying that otherworldly wisdom that still amazed her parents. "The ones who've been hiding in the spaces between worlds. They think they're coming to stop us, but really they're coming home." The Guardians moved closer to Lily, their forms now permanently caught between wolf and human, creating a triangle of protective energy around her. The wooden figurines spun even faster, their ancient symbols leaving trails of light in the air that wove themselves into the complex patterns Lily was maintaining. Dr. Henderson had given up trying to document what she was witnessing, her scientific training overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. "The convergence isn't just about bringing worlds together," she realized aloud. "It's about healing a wound in reality itself." Outside, the storm had intensified, but in ways that defied natural law. Rain fell upward, catching the light and creating bridges between earth and sky. The spirit bells chimed in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of space and time, their music calling to powers that had been sleeping since the world was young. Through the windows, they could see more shadows gathering at the edges of their property, but these were different from before. Some took on almost human forms, while others appeared as fragments of ancient creatures, all drawn to the light that Lily was weaving between worlds. "They remember," the female guardian said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Deep inside, they remember when all things were one, before the great separation. That memory is what brings them here, even though they think they come to fight." As if proving her words, several of the shadow forms began to press against the barriers, not with violence, but with something that looked almost like longing. Lily responded by adjusting the patterns of light, creating openings that were also bridges, inviting but not forcing connection. "Watch," she instructed her amazed family. "This is what the Guardians taught me. Everything wants to be whole again. Even the darkness." As they watched, the first of the shadow beings crossed the threshold. Instead of attacking, it began to transform, its darkness blending with light in ways that created new colors, new possibilities. Others followed, each transformation releasing bursts of energy that Lily skillfully wove into her expanding network of connections. Clare clutched Ethan's hand as they witnessed their daughter orchestrating this impossible reunion of forces. The wooden figurines had begun to emit a high, clear tone that somehow made the air itself more permeable to change. The Guardian's eyes glowed with the same amber light as Lily's, their ancient power flowing freely now between all worlds. "The balance is shifting," the tallest Guardian announced, his voice carrying both joy and caution. "But the greatest challenge still approaches. There are those who have grown too comfortable with division, who have built their power on keeping things apart. They will not surrender that power easily." As if summoned by his words, a new presence made itself known, a force so ancient it felt like a void in reality itself. It pressed against Lily's network of light and shadow from multiple directions at once, searching for weaknesses, testing the strength of these new connections. But Lily stood firm, her small hands moving with increasing confidence as she adjusted and reinforced her patterns. The transformed shadow beings, now glowing with their own inner light, moved to support her efforts, adding their power to the growing harmony. "Remember," she called out to the approaching force, her voice somehow carrying across all dimensions at once. "Remember when you were part of everything too. Remember what it felt like to be whole." The air around them grew thick with potential as two fundamental forces, the urge to separate and the drive toward unity, approached their final confrontation. The Matthews family, the Guardians, and all the transformed beings stood together in that extraordinary moment, watching as their reality trembled on the edge of its greatest transformation. In the heart of this convergence, Lily continued her work, weaving light and shadow, past and present, physical and spiritual, into patterns that had never existed before and had always been waiting to emerge. The next few moments would determine not just their fate, but the very nature of reality itself. The ancient force that pressed against their protective barriers finally revealed itself, not as a monster or demon, but as a swirling void of pure separation, a power that had grown strong by keeping things apart. It manifested as a massive distortion in the air, bending light and shadow around itself like a black hole bending starlight. The wooden figurines suddenly blazed with such intensity that their light pierced through all dimensions at once, revealing the true nature of what they faced. Through this enhanced sight, they could see that the void wasn't simply a force of destruction. It was the original wound in reality, the first great separation that had started everything. "Oh," Lily breathed, her voice filled with sudden understanding. "It's lonely." The Guardians exchanged glances of surprise, their forms shifting between wolf and human as they absorbed this simple but profound insight. The female Guardian stepped forward, her ancient eyes wide with realization. "Of course," she whispered. "It had to separate itself to create space for everything else to exist. And in doing so, it lost its connection to all it had created." The void pulsed with what might have been agreement or denial, sending waves of distortion through the networks of light Lily had woven. But instead of trying to strengthen her barriers against this assault, Lily did something unexpected. She began to let them dissolve. "Lily, no!" Clare cried out, moving to protect her daughter. But Ethan held her back, recognizing something in their child's expression that spoke of deeper wisdom than any of them possessed. "It's okay, Mommy," Lily assured her, even as the barriers continued to fade. "Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the same walls that keep us from healing." The Guardians helped me understand that. As the last of the protective barriers dissolved, the void surged forward. But instead of attacking, it found itself caught in a new kind of pattern that Lily had been weaving all along. This wasn't a pattern of separation or even protection, but one of integration and wholeness. The spirit bells began to ring in a new harmony, one that seemed to resonate with the void itself. The transformed shadow beings added their voices to the chorus, creating a symphony of unity that bridged all divisions. The Guardians, now fully understanding Lily's intention, positioned themselves to help channel and direct the enormous energies being released. "Look," Dr. Henderson gasped, pointing to her notes. The symbols that had been shifting and changing on her pages suddenly stabilized, revealing patterns that matched exactly what Lily was creating in the air around them. "She's not fighting the separation, she's showing it how to be part of everything again." The void's swirling energies began to change, responding to this unexpected offering. Instead of consuming the light, it started to blend with it, creating new colors and patterns that had never existed before. The wooden figurines spun in perfect synchronization with this transformation, their ancient symbols now telling a new story, not of division and guardianship, but of reunion and healing. Lily stood in the center of this cosmic dance, her small hands moving with the confidence of one who sees the true nature of things. She was weaving together not just light and shadow, or physical and spiritual, but the very forces of creation and separation themselves. "Everything is part of everything else," she sang, her voice carrying the melody of this new reality. "Even the things that thought they had to stay apart forever." The void's transformation accelerated, its energies of separation transforming into something new, a force that could create space for differences while maintaining the underlying connections that bound all things together. The Guardians moved in harmony with this change, their forms now flowing freely between all possible shapes as the boundaries between worlds became permeable rather than divisive. The air around them filled with dancing lights that were also shadows, each one containing the seed of its opposite, just as day contains the promise of night, and night holds the certainty of dawn. The spirit bells rang out in triumph, their sound carrying the story of this transformation to all corners of reality. And through it all, Lily continued her work, her amber eyes glowing with the light of universal understanding, as she helped to heal the oldest wound in existence, not by closing it, but by showing it how to become a bridge instead of a barrier. The transformation of the void sent ripples through all layers of reality. In Whitefish, people stepped out of their homes, drawn by a sense of wonder they couldn't explain. The sky above the Matthews home had become a canvas of impossible colors, where light and shadow danced together in patterns that spoke of ancient truths and new possibilities. Inside the house, Dr. Henderson watched in amazement as her years of research literally rewrote itself before her eyes. The symbols in her notebook shifted and changed, telling not just the history of separation she had been studying, but the story of reunion that was unfolding around them. The boundaries between academic observer and participant in the miraculous had dissolved completely. The Guardians moved through the space around Lily in an intricate dance, their forms now flowing freely between all possible shapes. They were no longer just protectors, but active participants in the transformation, their ancient knowledge combining with Lily's innocent wisdom to help guide the energies of change. "The walls between worlds aren't meant to be barriers," Lily explained, her voice carrying echoes of every language ever spoken. "They're meant to be like the walls of a heart, flexible, moving, helping everything flow together while still keeping its own special rhythm." As she spoke, the transformed void began to pulse like a cosmic heartbeat, its energies now flowing through reality in ways that supported connection rather than separation. The wooden figurines, still spinning in the air, had become like constellations in this new arrangement of forces, their symbols transformed into maps for navigating between worlds. Clare and Ethan stood together, watching their daughter with a mixture of awe and profound love. They could see now that she had never needed protection. She had been born to help heal this ancient wound, to show even the most fundamental forces of the universe how to dance together again. The spirit bells rang out in complex harmonies that seemed to celebrate this understanding. Their music carried through all dimensions at once, touching everyone in Whitefish, with a moment of clarity about their own connection to everything around them. Gardens bloomed out of season, animals emerged from the forest to gather peacefully in yards, and for a brief, beautiful moment, everyone could see the threads of light that connected all living things. "It's not about making everything the same," Lily continued, her hands moving in patterns that celebrated differences while weaving them into a greater whole. "It's about helping everything remember that being different doesn't mean having to be separate." The transformed shadow beings, now glowing with their own inner light, moved through the spaces around them like schools of ethereal fish, their movements creating new patterns of possibility. They had become living examples of how darkness could contain light, just as light could create shadow, each defining and enriching the other. Dr. Henderson had finally stopped trying to document what she was seeing and simply stood in wonder. "This changes everything," she whispered, then laughed at the inadequacy of those words to describe what was happening. "Or perhaps it restores everything to what it was always meant to be." The Guardians gathered around Lily, their ancient power now fully aligned with her innate understanding. The tallest one spoke, his voice carrying the wisdom of centuries. "We protected the boundaries between worlds for so long, waiting for one who could show us that those boundaries were meant to be bridges all along. Outside, the storm that had brought them to this moment was transforming into something else, a gentle rain that fell in multiple directions at once, each droplet catching the light in ways that showed glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities." The people of Whitefish would later describe it as the night when reality dreamed itself awake. In the center of this transformation, Lily continued her gentle work, her small hands moving with the confidence of one who sees the true nature of things. She was no longer just bridging worlds. She was helping to create a new way for them to exist together, where separation and unity could dance as partners rather than opponents. The wooden figurines began to descend slowly, their spinning gradually coming to rest as the new patterns of reality stabilized around them. But the symbols carved into their surfaces had changed permanently, now telling stories of connection and renewal rather than boundaries and guardianship. The dawn that broke over Whitefish that morning was unlike any other. The light seemed to come from everywhere at once, casting no shadows, because it had learned to dance with darkness instead of opposing it. The spirit bells chimed softly in the gentle breeze, their music now a permanent part of the world's symphony. The Matthews home had become a nexus point where multiple realities gently overlapped, like waves meeting on a peaceful shore. The Guardians, no longer bound by the old duties of separation, had taken on a new role as teachers and guides for this transformed world. Their forms shifted freely now between wolf and human, each shape a celebration of the possibility that had always existed within them. Lily sat in her garden, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in colors that had never existed before, colors that could only exist in the spaces where different realities merged. The transformed shadow beings had become like friendly spirits, playing with the local children who could now see them, teaching them games that transcended ordinary physics. The hard part wasn't bringing everything together, Lily explained to Doctor. Henderson, who had finally found a way to document the new reality by letting her notebook become part of the story it was recording. The hard part was helping everyone remember that they were never really apart. The void that had once threatened them had transformed into something beautiful, a living membrane that helped different realities communicate and flow together, like the spaces between heartbeats that make music possible. It pulsed gently in the background of everything, no longer lonely but an essential part of the whole. Claire and Ethan watched their daughter playing in this transformed world, realizing that their initial fears for her safety had been transformed into a deeper understanding. She hadn't needed protection. She had needed the freedom to help reality remember how to dance. The wooden figurines, now permanently transformed, had taken their place on the mantelpiece, where they continued to shift and change, telling endless stories of connection and renewal. Their symbols had become a living language that children could read instinctively, understanding truths that adults had spent centuries trying to rediscover. Dr. Henderson's research had evolved into something new, not just the study of ancient mysteries, but the active documentation of an evolving reality where magic and science were no longer separate disciplines, but different expressions of the same fundamental truths. The Guardians, their ancient duties transformed but not ended, continued to watch over Whitefish, but now they protected the connections between worlds rather than the boundaries. They had become teachers of a new way of being, helping others understand what Lily had shown them. That true protection comes from integration, not isolation. "Every ending is just a new kind of beginning," Lily said, standing in her garden where the spirit bells chimed in harmony with the pulse of this renewed world. The seeds she planted grew into plants that existed in multiple realities at once, their blooms telling stories of infinite possibility. The people of Whitefish had adapted to their transformed reality with surprising ease, perhaps because deep inside, they had always known that magic was real. Children played games that involved stepping between worlds, while their parents learned to appreciate the beauty of a universe where boundaries had become bridges. And so the story of the Matthews family became part of a larger tale, one of healing, transformation, and the endless dance of all things. Their experience showed that the greatest changes often come not from fighting against what we fear, but from helping it remember its place in the great dance of existence. As the sun set on this new world, casting light in impossible colors across the Montana sky, Lily stood with her parents and the Guardians, watching the spirit bells sway in a breeze that carried whispers from 1,000 realities. The wolf-shaped shadows they cast were also human-shaped, and something else entirely, a reminder that in this transformed world, nothing needed to be just one thing anymore. "This isn't the end," Lily said, smiling as she watched new patterns of light and shadow play across the evening sky. "It's just the beginning of a much bigger story." And in the gentle twilight of this transformed reality, where magic and mundane danced as equal partners in the great symphony of existence, her words rang true with the weight of both ancient wisdom and new possibilities. For in Whitefish, Montana, where a little girl had helped heal the oldest wound in reality, every moment now held the promise of miracle and wonder waiting to unfold. Dear listeners, we hope the extraordinary journey of Lily Matthews and the Guardians has touched your hearts and opened your minds to new possibilities. This tale of transformation and healing reminds us that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from fighting against what we fear, but from finding new ways to embrace what we don't understand. To continue exploring these magical realms, we've prepared a special playlist of equally enchanting stories. Find it by clicking to your left. If this story has moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the boundaries between reality and magic, between what is and what could be. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Perhaps you too have felt moments when the walls between worlds grew thin, or when magic seemed to peek through the fabric of ordinary life. Join us tomorrow for another journey into the extraordinary. Until then, may your own story be filled with wonder and possibility.